Good afternoon, and welcome to our sixth session today. We're talking today about governance issues in a global setting. And the basic pitch, not to give too much of things away from the very beginning, is that so much of the issues dealing with global climate change hinge on national level politics. And the key to successful efforts to try to deal with the global problems of climate change will depend ultimately on the ability to be able to solve country by country, nation by nation, the political issues that so often make it difficult for us to try to attack those puzzles and problems. And so that's what we want to try to talk about. A sense of where we're going from here. First of all, on March the 3rd, there'll be no lecture. Those of us here in the room are going to be working on the course project, and we'll be back with a report to all of you on that a little bit later. We will be returning on March the 17th after the University of Pennsylvania spring break on March the 10th. And so this will be the last lecture for 2 weeks that will be posted on the internet. So everybody have a little bit of a break to think about this, to converse on the course commons, and to explore the big issues that we're talking about. The big issues for today that we want to talk about are the following. First, the Obama initiatives that are very different from the ones that the Bush administration explored. And in the context of the book that we were reading for today, the book by Cass entitled The Failures of American and European Climate Policy, we want to try to see how the changes that the Obama administration is considering may transform the way in which the politics happens in the United States and the prospects for some kind of effort around the world. Secondly, to look at some of the arguments in the book that Cass lays out. Third, I want to try to demonstrate how we can think about some of these things with a very interesting new application from Google Earth that with some luck we may be able to actually show you here. And then finally, we have a guest lecturer that's appearing a little bit later on. More on that. First, the Obama initiatives. If there's anything that's clear, it's that the Obama administration plans on taking a very different tack on the issues of climate change than was the case in the Bush administration. The Bush administration, for a very long time, took the approach that it wasn't clear that the science was clear on whether or not there was such a thing as climate change. If so, what the causes of climate change might be, and if the causes of climate change might be man-made action, whether or not it made sense in the short term to engage in strategies to try to deal with that in the longer term, and therefore whether or not government policy ought to change. So in a whole series of steps, the administration resisted an effort to try to engage in a more tough attack on climate change issues. The Obama administration, in its first month, has signaled very clearly that things are going to be very different, and very different in the following ways. One of the things that the administration has now signaled is that the Environmental Protection Agency will make an endangerment finding about carbon dioxide gas. Two things. First, carbon dioxide gas is a greenhouse gas, and as we saw earlier in the course, the argument is that as greenhouse gases get up into the atmosphere, they have the effect of creating a kind of greenhouse that holds heat in, that leads to climate change over the long haul. So that's the argument about CO2 in particular. And the endangerment finding is as follows. The Environmental Protection Agency has, as a matter of law, the right and, in fact, the obligation to make assessments of different threats to the public health and welfare. And if it finds that a chemical, an emission, a substance has something that will endanger the public health and welfare, then it is required by law to identify that, to state that it's an endangerment, and if it endangers the public health and safety, to act in a regulatory way to restrict the ability of people to emit those things that could cause danger. Now, if you step back, you can understand that it makes perfect sense in terms of law. It doesn't make sense for companies, for individuals, for nations, for cities, for whoever to emit chemicals that could cause trouble. It makes sense for Congress to have given EPA the authority when something dangerous is discovered to root in and to try to eliminate it. The interesting thing here is the decision by EPA now just 1 month into the Obama administration that carbon dioxide will be found to be a danger to public health and safety, which is a way of saying greenhouse gases are real, that carbon dioxide is a real greenhouse gas, that greenhouse gases emitted in the atmosphere are involved in climate change, that kind of climate change is an endangerment to public health and welfare, and anything that's an endangerment then requires governmental action. So I've noticed the logical chain. Notice how different it is from the Bush administration. And notice how simply by saying and certifying that CO2 presents a public health endangerment, it dramatically changes the way that the politics and the policy operates. Once the Environmental Protection Agency finds that something is an endangerment to the public health and welfare, then it's required to issue regulations. And so EPA has now signaled that it's about to issue regulations that in fact will restrict carbon dioxide, and in the interest of trying to make it something that will be managerially possible to do so that they don't have to go after every single source, every single car, every single truck, every single lawnmower, every single anything that emits carbon dioxide, then the assumption is that the administration will set a threshold of emissions and that the regulations will affect only facilities that emit more than that amount as a kind of first step. Go after the big emitters. That, in an administrative way, makes sense. But the interesting legal point as well is that once the Environmental Protection Agency finds that carbon dioxide is something that endangers the public health and welfare, then anybody who emits it is potentially subject to a lawsuit from anybody, any of us, saying, you are emitting carbon dioxide, you therefore are endangering my public health and safety, therefore I have standing in court, and therefore I can and I'm going to sue you. And so the strategy is really twofold. One is regulatory strategy on the part of government, but the second is creating a new form of possible legal action where individuals or interest groups can sue companies or anyone else who they believe emits carbon dioxide, whether they're covered by the regulations or not, on the grounds that, given the fact that greenhouse gases, the argument is it affects everybody, that the emissions therefore affect me, whoever I may be, and therefore I have a right to sue, something that the EPA has already found endangers public health and safety. So it's a two-thrust, two-point argument. One is that the Environmental Protection Agency is going to use existing legal authority to issue new regulations to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And in doing so, it may very well create a broader opportunity for more action elsewhere. The change from the Bush administration could not be more significant because, remember, as I said at the beginning today, the Bush administration at the beginning contested whether or not greenhouse gases had any real effect, whether the effect was man-made or not, whether it was man-made was something that required action, whether the action was too expensive or too complicated. And in a brushstroke, all at once, the Obama administration has knocked every single one of those arguments down with this signal that it is now going to declare carbon dioxide something that endangers the public health and safety. It's really interesting in the politics of things, in the context of this week's readings and this week's discussions and this week's blog entries that the students have posted, that we can look at something as simple as a simple legal finding that carbon dioxide endangers public health and safety, and by one simple step create such a radical transformation in governmental policy. As we explore this a little bit further, too, there have been some reactions and some pushback on this, not surprisingly. There are those who, in the private sector, are arguing that if this is just an awful time to try to engage in a broad, sweeping change in environmental policy because it's going to be expensive, and because it's expensive, it's going to incur lots of extra costs at a time when the economy is already weakened. And so some companies are already arguing that the idea of now trying to engage in this strategy is exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time. The second thing is that Representative John Dingell, who's a Democrat from Michigan, who's been a staunch opponent to increasing regulation of greenhouse gases, talks about the potential of what he calls a glorious mess. His state, of course, depends heavily on coal and manufacturing. His state is a heavy greenhouse gas emitter. And his argument, his worry, is that if industries within the state of Michigan are required to make extra investments simply to try to meet new greenhouse gas standards, that it may very well cost jobs, that it may cause some businesses to go out of business, and that, coupled with the first argument, could create exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. And so the argument here is that this is a bad thing at a bad time. The Obama administration, however, does not seem to be deterred by those arguments, and it seems intent on pushing ahead. The big problem politically for the Obama administration is, given the issues with the banks, given the issues with the bailout, given the issues with the stimulus package, given all the problems with the economy, how many other things that were part of the Obama agenda during the campaign are now issues that the administration is going to pursue aggressively. And early on, one of the things that the administration signaled very clearly that it was going to do, that it was going to follow through on, was an effort to try to deal with climate change issues, knowing full well that the Copenhagen round is coming up in December. So in addition to this endangerment finding, which is one of those things that sounds incredibly complicated, but is like a key in a lock that opens all kinds of legal possibilities, the administration is also talking about an effort to try to press Congress into an aggressive effort to try to bring down the level of greenhouse gases, and with a commitment in federal policy to achieve by 2050 a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 80% over what it had been a century before. From 1950 to 2050, a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. How did you go about doing that? The administration favors a cap and trade, creating a cap that would be ratcheted down over time, the creation of pollution rights that could be traded, and that these rights would be traded in ways that would create economically efficient ways of reducing the overall level of emissions. Now, over the course in the previous lectures, we've explored each of these possibilities, and the cap and trade proposal seems to be the one to which the Obama administration is leaning. Note that there are other alternatives. There are proposals by conservatives in particular. There was an article in the New York Times last Sunday by Ben Stein, sometime comedian, sometime economic policy analyst, arguing that the real smart thing to do instead of cap and trade would be to pursue an emissions tax. So conservatives are using and in favor of using a much more fundamental market-based approach by taxing the things that we don't want and by subsidizing the things that we do. But the Obama administration seems to be pursuing something that has the sureness of the cap along with the market-based pieces of the trade. And on top of that, and a kind of gun behind the door, the administration has also said to Congress, we want you to pass this. We really think this is the way to go. If you don't, however, we are going to reach for administrative actions through the Environmental Protection Agency to create regulations that would accomplish the same kinds of things. So it's really an interesting puzzle here. The administration has decided it's going to act, has signaled with the finding that it endangers the public health and safety, that it wants to try to work with Congress to create a cap and trade system, but is prepared to act administratively if Congress doesn't. There's a whole series of efforts to try to box the opponents in advance of the Copenhagen round in a way of trying to deal with Congress in an effort to say this is a fundamental policy stand that the administration pursues and is interested in trying to get at. But it gets at the underlying question. What is it that we really ought to try to do? I mean, how important and which kinds of strategies are we going to use? And in terms both of effectiveness of policy and in the reality of politics, what makes the most sense? Does it make more sense for the administration to try to go it alone through EPA, through powers that EPA already has, or to try to enlist Congress in the effort? Remember that in the United States, there are a variety of different strategies for going at this. There could be a treaty negotiated at Copenhagen, which would require a much larger majority in the Senate. There could be legislative action in the Congress, which requires only a majority vote, but which does require 60 votes in the Senate to shut down debate. Should the administration use administrative action within the Environmental Protection Agency, which has the advantage of being able to move more quickly, but undercutting in some of the broader political support the administration wants to try to build? And in a political sense, just how much of a wedge issue is climate change across the board? How much of its political stake does the administration want to try to put on these questions of climate change? This really echoes the arguments that Cass makes in the book about the importance of domestic policy in terms of framing the national strategy.
Hasn't Obama also kind of made it his, well, at least in his rhetoric in the campaign about, creating green jobs as a way to, make these problems on the economy alleviated, as well as the fact that last week, when Secretary of State Clinton was in China, she talked about she disregarded human rights in order to propel a environmental or the greenhouse gas argument forward. So where does that kind of stuff fall into the puzzle?
Yeah, and the important thing here is there are other strategies that the administration has at its disposal that may consider that there are things that the administration has argued in terms of job creation, that green jobs are another way of thinking about regulation, that Republicans traditionally have argued that if you impose extra costs on industries to try to meet greenhouse gas standards, you're going to cut employment, or at least you're going to reduce the amount of growth because it's a kind of dead weight loss. It's a kind of extra weight the company would have to drag along. Obama's making a very different kind of argument. He's making an argument that says that we'll have to pay some extra costs, but we'll be creating new jobs. We'll be creating 21st century jobs. We'll be creating new opportunities. We're not going to be undercutting jobs, but we're going to be creating new jobs and helping the United States meet its international obligations at the same time. And so Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is out trying to make this argument as a way also of trying to deal with the problems that will come with negotiations with the Chinese later on by trying to make a different argument by repositioning the United States. Note, and this is in the context of Cass's argument in the readings for this week, the interconnections between domestic politics and the international climate change movement. And one of the things that Cass argues is that you can't understand climate change from a global setting without understanding the way that individual politics and individual countries play into that debate. And that's really the kind of the central argument of the book. It gets right at your question. The real puzzle here is how does that go about working? I mean, how does domestic politics work? And one of the things that Cass argues is that depending on where it is that you sit, there are different ideas about who ought to bear responsibility and who ought to bear the costs. One argument says developed countries created most of the mess and therefore ought to be responsible for cleaning most of it up. There are others who say, look, we've got a problem. It's a problem that affects all of us. We all have a collective responsibility. We all around the world have a collective responsibility for doing something about it. So the challenge is now trying to figure out how to try to weigh those different kinds of ideas. As we all know, those different kinds of ideas don't affect everybody differently. An argument that those who create most of the greenhouse gas emissions ought to be responsible for most of the cost of cleaning them up means that the United States and China and other major industrializing nations will have most of the costs. Arguments that everybody ought to share in the effort means that the costs are much more broadly shared. Which one wins? It's in part a political question and part an economic question, but both of them are questions with profound distributional consequences as well. And so the basic questions are how to go about doing whatever it is that we want to do. Should we have a system where in the end each state, each nation has to assume its own share and responsibility of things? Or is it a problem where we have some kind of broader international system where we decide, for example, an international market in which we all collectively contribute? The problem is that with the latter, with an international strategy, we don't have an international governance system capable of enforcing it. And the problem of the first is as long as any effort to climate change reduction depends on national politics, any kind of change in national politics can undermine the effort anywhere to try to get at it. So as long as it requires everybody and every nation to act, we run the risk that some of the actions won't occur. This is a really tough dilemma here that we face, an effort to try to figure out how to get at the puzzles of getting the problem defined and then trying to figure out how we want to try to get action to occur. If you look just simply in the book about the comparison between Germany and the United States, you see a pretty good comparison about the way in which two very different countries came at this problem. On the one hand, the Germans started with a kind of retrospective view that led to a moral conclusion. The retrospective view was that we all had a role in creating this pollution, and now we have something that in fact does endanger public health and safety, and that we all have a collective moral right to try to respond. And so since it's a moral right that we have to try to embrace it as a matter of national policy that we all have to try to deal with. And many of the Europeans in general have pursued this approach, and part of the almost religious zeal in some parts of Europe toward issues of climate change come from this basic moral understanding about the nature of the problem and the need for an answer. On the other hand, in the United States, the view, for the most part, until very recently, has been much more prospective. Yes, maybe there's climate change, maybe there's not, but in any event, from now, the costs of trying to clean that up are very high. And if the costs are very high, there's no point in being able to make those investments until we're really, really sure that the problem is serious enough to make the transformation in the economy happen in the way in which we need to have it happen for it to take place. And so we have this argument that goes back and forth. Those who argue from a basically moral point of view can make an argument and a conclusion that what's going on is that we now need to act regardless of the cost because it's a moral issue. If you allow the issue to be framed in economic terms, you can create a different set of arguments, a different set of incentives, and a different kind of politics. So, moral versus practical questions matter. Prospective versus retrospective issues matter. Rhetoric, in terms of moral versus pragmatic issues matter. All these things affect local politics, and local politics affect national strategies. So that if you want to try to understand the way in which inevitably problems of politics happen, we have to understand the way in which they play into a role of shaping national and international debate. That gets to the question of different kinds of approaches. What we have is an inescapable conclusion that while issue of climate change is a global, is an international, is a worldwide phenomenon, it's also one that, for better or worse, tends to be the product, in terms of policy, of national level politics. And that national level politics is a reflection of the rhetoric and the way in which issues are framed. And because moral standing and politics tends to be very different in different places, then we end up with a very different kind of approach for getting at these things. We have a guest speaker here with us today whose timing is absolutely impeccable on this because we're dealing with questions of climate change. So we'll take just a quick time out where we're taping this, and so we'll take a time out now while we do a quick switcheroo. Thank you very much for coming.
Just walk his bags up 2 flights.
Ah.
All right, should I just start? Well, my name is Adam Finkel. I'm on the faculty at the law school. Half time I teach up at the UMDNJ Public Health School. The other half of the time, and I direct the Penn Program on Regulation, which is an inter-university group that Don is affiliated with. And we just happen to have this wonderful speaker coming at 4:30 for our monthly regulation seminar series. Your class is over by then, so I can't invite them to skip out of class, but you're all welcome to come over to Huntsman Hall at Wharton at 4:30. So this is Dr. Tom Lovejoy, who, among many other things, is president of the Heinz Center, which is, can I call it a think tank? It's really more of a think tank, I guess, than an NGO at this point. But it was originally a creation of the Environmental Defense Fund, but it's the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment. If that's in the right order, where he's been for about 10 years at Heinz?
2002.
Okay, 7 years. But before that, all kinds of prominent positions, director of one of the big programs at the World Wildlife Fund, assistant secretary for environment at the Smithsonian, been involved in executive branch positions, I guess in the Bush 1 administration, but has basically been at the World Wildlife Fund for 35 years now, if I've got that right, and may be best known as the founder of the PBS show Nature, which I guess was around the same time in the early mid-'70s. Originator of the debt for nature swaps idea, decades of field work on if you've ever seen the pictures of patches of forest in the Amazon and how, I hope I get this right, how small the patch gets to disrupt the ecology and the biodiversity of that patch, that was Dr. Lovejoy's origination, and it's been picked up and followed on by many others. So I'm going to let him talk to you, and hope you enjoy it.
Great. Well, thank you. So why don't I just sort of talk about 10 or 15 minutes about climate change and various aspects that I've been working on over the years, and then throw it open for questions of any sort you'd like to ask. So I'm a biologist, and I fell into working on the interface of science and public policy about 1973 when I went to work for the World Wildlife Fund US and became employee number 13. It was that small. And I thought I'd go for 2 years and then go back on the science and adventure track that I had sort of dreamed of for the rest of my life. But I didn't, and I stayed there 14 years, and then I had 12 at the Smithsonian and 3 years at the World Bank, and since 2002 at this Heinz Center. So basically, over that trajectory, I started out sort of helping the World Wildlife Fund think about protecting individual species or particular kinds of habitats in new national parks or whatever. But the lens kept getting larger and larger, and the final piece which drove it wide open was about 1985 or something like that, when I began to wonder what climate change might actually mean for the natural world. And so I've sort of pursued that track for the ensuing 23 years, done 2 books with co-editors on it. First came out in 1992, just in time for the Earth Summit in Rio. And at that point, all you could do was sort of conjecture what it might mean. Look at sort of the geological past on how climate had changed and how nature had responded to it. By the time I did the second book in 2005, it was clear that, in fact, nature was starting to be affected virtually everywhere you look. And so the first point I'd like to make is that when you look at the topic through biological eyes, the way I do, you quickly come to the conclusion that ecosystems and the natural underpinnings of society are about as sensitive as anything that concerns policymakers about climate change. And to just sort of jump to a sort of conclusion on that, we're actually at the point now where we're already seeing abrupt change in ecosystems. So there are vast stretches of coniferous forest in North America now with up to, say, 70% of all the trees dead and dying because the summer is longer and the native pine bark beetle gets the upper hand. So it's a huge fire management and timber management problem. And similarly, we're now seeing coral reefs basically break down in their fundamental partnership between the coral animal and the alga, and they basically go from a technicolor world to what's called a bleaching event, in which most of the diversity and life is lost. It's just a couple of degrees is all it takes to make that kind of thing happen. And we're also seeing the oceans becoming more acid because of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So as you hear about potential planetary engineering solutions to the temperature aspects of climate change, just be aware that whatever you do to fix the temperature, it's not going to deal with the CO2 and ocean acidity problem. So I guess that's one point, is that just the biology of the planet is already responding, and it's really super sensitive to climate change. I think the second point is that when you look at the energy side and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, and you look at all the best positions of all the countries at the moment in terms of where they're committed or say they will pursue on emissions reductions, you plug all those into an appropriate model, and you end up at 700 parts per million. So pre-industrial is 280. 350 is the point above which I don't think it's safe for ecosystems. We're at 390 and going up faster than the worst case scenario of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So there's just a huge energy and economic and policy challenge and opportunity that finally is about to begin to be addressed, at least in its first phase in Washington. So that's a second piece of it. A third interesting piece that most people don't know a lot about is that if you look at annual greenhouse gas emissions, about 20% of it actually comes from the destruction of tropical forests. And if you are a biologist like me, you realize that in fact all greenhouse gases that we're generating come from biological sources in the end. That's what coal, gas, and oil are. That's just ancient biological productivity being ignited in an instant and releasing the CO2 to the atmosphere. So there's this modern day piece of it, which is tropical deforestation, which is large enough so that Brazil is the fourth largest emitter on the planet, and Indonesia is the third. We're the second, and China's now ahead of us. So one important thing that can be done, which is good for forests and biodiversity and a lot of other things, is to actually try and tackle that deforestation part of the equation. And of course, that is one of the things that is definitely will be part of the discussions at the meeting of the parties of the convention in Copenhagen at the end of the year. Now, if you think beyond that, there's a new piece that's just beginning to dawn on everybody, which is biological too. And that is, if you really look at it, the terrestrial ecosystems of the planet have lost an enormous amount of carbon in the last 300 years, 200 to 250 billion tons. And the extent to which we can restore those ecosystems by restoring degraded grazing land, conducting agriculture in a way that restores soil carbon, do active reforestation, and similar kinds of things, you can actually pull some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Not a big enough number that it makes our energy challenge any easier. But what it can do is actually sort of trim the top off what otherwise would have been the peak amount of climate change. So I think that's a new part of the agenda, and if ever there is a serious policy challenge, it's how you put together the terrestrial ecosystems sequestering carbon with the land to produce biofuels as a substitute for fossil fuels, with the land for growing food for growing numbers of people on the planet, and the land to essentially protect our biological diversity heritage around the world. So it's become basically the be-all and end-all land use challenge. And I think that piece of it is only just beginning to dawn on a lot of people working with all of this. And I guess the only other thing I might say at this point is it's quite astonishing to read some stuff like in the Science Times today. People just really don't understand how big this issue is and how urgent it is, and somehow sort of think that we can float free of the impact on the environment. So that's a huge challenge. And I think having an administration in Washington which is really serious about the issue and some real leadership going on, both in terms of what it will do in raising awareness nationally, but also beginning to change the psychology of behavior of others in international negotiations, is going to make a huge difference. And the big issue on the table is how fast you can move all of that. So that's how I sort of scope the problem from my particular vantage point. And I have, as I said, I've spent 35 or so years in Washington now living on this interface between science and public policy. And, it's really exciting when it works. And that means having people in the government in positions of significant authority who are interested in learning about it. And we have a lot of those now. The President's science advisor probably will be confirmed by a Senate vote this week. John Holdren spent a lifetime working on these issues. Jane Lubchenco will be head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a marine biologist. Similarly has been looking at climate change in the world's oceans and the productivity of the oceans and support of human beings. And then we have Carol Browner, the energy environment czar in the White House, who just as sharp as can be. It's really nice to just call her up before the election and talk to her about the carbon sequestration potential of ecosystems and listen to her, sort of get it in like 30 seconds. It's such a good feeling. Then you have to figure out how do you put the incentives into things that make it all work. And, we have a farm bill, for example, which has always been about getting income to farmers. Well, there's absolutely no reason why the Farm Bill cannot reward farmers for farming in ways that restore carbon to the soils. And those numbers can be significant. So that's kind of the stuff that's in play right now, and I'm sure there will be a big effort to have a cap and trade bill this year. And on Monday morning, which is an unusual day for elected officials to be in town because they have to, tend to their constituencies, there was a major event around energy that went from like 8:30 in the morning to 12:30. And it was hosted by the Senate Majority Leader, who then stayed for the entire time. Majority leaders don't do that. They've got too many things to attend to. But that tells you how seriously all of this is now being taken. So I just throw it open to you to ask any questions you'd like. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak more about your work with the World Bank and Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm actually from Kingston, Jamaica, and I've seen for myself a lot of the bleaching of the coral reef. Over 50% of our coral reef is gone. It's like one of the most stark contrasts that you can see. The beautiful colors of the coral reef to death and completely white and blank. And I was just wondering what some of the some criticisms you might have of the World Bank's approaches, or what you think they've done right, and what you see.
Well, the interesting is I've actually sort of worked with or tried to push the World Bank probably since the late or maybe even mid-'70s. And then I had the 3 years when I was actually there, and I was given the title of Chief Biodiversity Advisor to the bank, which meant that I could talk to the president whenever I wanted to. In 1985, I went over to the bank and I found this letter, 15 years later, because my filing system is terrible. And it was a letter from the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean in 1985, thanking me for coming over and introducing him to the topic of biological diversity. So that's sort of where the bank was at that point. Most of the people didn't think about the environmental issues very much. They were pushed by Congress to take some of it into account. And in those days, the World Bank was the major source of international funding for most big projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. So to the extent that you could lever the bank to pay attention to these things, you could really lever a lot. That's no longer true, or at least it wasn't true until the economy went into its tailspin. There are just many avenues that governments can go to for funding for various things. But also since that time, the bank has actually hired a lot of people who have environmental expertise, biologists, et cetera. So the bank not only in many instances is much better about these issues, sometimes does pure sort of environmental projects if a country in question wants to borrow the money for it, unless occasionally there's some discretionary funding, but it's usually much smaller. But at the same time, there's a lot of the standard old-style development projects that countries ask for. And then there's a big push and pull between the bank and its various policies about environment, safeguards, and the client country. And the reason there's a certain amount of imperfection in all of this is the bank and the Inter-American Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, that are all governed by boards that are made up of donor countries and client countries. So there are many different points of view on these boards. So, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, the Inter-American Development Bank has been very divided at the board level about these kinds of issues, principally driven by countries like Argentina, which basically doesn't want to pay any attention. But I think in the end, the big development banks are nowadays more a force for good than unintended environmental impacts. And it's going to be really interesting to see the kind of role they play in the coming years, especially given sort of the economic scene in which they'll now be operating. And they are, the bank is looking at carbon and forests and all those kinds of issues, at least in an experimental way. So it's a mixed picture, but it is certainly very different from what it was 25 years ago. And when Jim Wolfenson was the president and I was the biodiversity advisor, he certainly got it. And even Wolfowitz, who sort of had a certain cast to him, let's put it that way, actually would consult me about Amazon issues, and had a son who basically educated his father about climate change. Quite interesting. And Bob Zoellick, the current president of the bank, is actually a bird watcher. So he gets this stuff. Really interesting. Yes?
I was just wondering how you, as a biologist and as a policy expert and whatnot, propose to, alleviate the, because you talk a lot about deforestation, how it's a huge problem, but it's the main industry for a country like Indonesia, and the timber and lumber and wood and whatnot is a big byproduct of their economy. How do you propose to or do you have any ideas of a way that we could not only make it so that they stop cutting down trees, but also give them sufficient.
Well, it's a really good question, and Indonesia is really the country where that is most crucial, because it's it's decades of history of plywood factories, and all kinds of things, filling more private pockets than public coffers, and a lot of illegal stuff going on. In the end, it all depends how elected officials end up looking at it. And now that there is this possibility of carbon payments for avoided deforestation, there are governors of some of the provinces in Indonesia who are really interested in that. They see that as a better long-term financial solution than essentially a cut-and-run timber operation. So there's never any simple, easy, clean solution. But once you can begin to reward companies and people for economic activities that are based on the forest but don't destroy it, you can change that balance. And so in Brazil, the biggest state in the Amazon is the state of Amazonas. And it's 2.3 times the size of Texas. It's the biggest unit other than a country in South America, right? And it has not had a bad deforestation problem because it has an economic free zone in its capital, Manaus, and most of the population is attracted by that, and it's not at, deforesting in the kinds of patterns that happen elsewhere in the Amazon. But nonetheless, that's just a matter of time. And so the governor, who sees the future of his state as being a forested state, has actually been experimenting with community grants, which are basically called forest grants, and it rewards the communities that have found ways to pursue their economic well-being that don't destroy the forest, and they get extra income for it. So I think that's the only way you're going to solve these kinds of things, where there's some big public good that you want to reward in the place of short-term gain. But it's going to be an ongoing story, and it'll get very particular to particular places. But in the end, if we really want to manage the climate and sort of the natural resources of the planet in any sensible way, we've got to be sort of essentially paying for it. Yes?
I know a lot of the debt swaps started, and Al Gore was a big negotiator for them. Since, I guess, Bush too, and then since then, is there like a return to these debt for land swaps, or is it?
Yeah. So for those who don't know about them, debt for nature swaps is something that I proposed in 1984 in an editorial op-ed in the New York Times, and I think the first one was done in 1987. And in one form or another, it involves the alleviation of a hard currency obligation by country X in return for its doing something with its own currency, which is a lot easier to manage for the country, that it wants to do anyway. Never works unless the country really wants to do it. And at the very outset, it wasn't national debt, it was actually commercial bank debt. But probably since the 80s, it's been almost exclusively nation-to-nation bilateral debt. And there's much more of it going on than anybody knows, because nobody's really sat there and tracked it down. It doesn't get recorded in any central place, but Spain does it, France does it, United States does it under something called the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. And it does get a little complicated, because even though you can have a country like Peru was at one point where literally the value of its debt on the secondary market was 2 cents on the dollar. That's how likely it was to be repaid. Right? But if it is owed to a national government by accounting rules, you can't just sort of wipe it out without writing a minus in the budget somewhere. So literally there has to be a physical appropriation for any of this stuff to go forward. Never has actually stopped a country from just entirely forgiving a debt if they had a political reason, right? You'll see it happen from time to time. But for something like this, it's more complicated, but it is ongoing. And I would guess it's at least above the 3 billion mark at this point. Yeah. Not a trivial number, but nonetheless, it's made a contribution. So I guess that's it.
You've only whetted our appetite on this. And I wish we had you for another hour or 2 or 3, and unfortunately, you're going over to give the presentation, and they have me for the rest of the time as well. So they end up by far on the worst side of this deal. But thanks so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Let me just say one final thing. All of this that I've gotten to was just trying to solve problems, just trying to find practical ways to advance what seems in everybody's interest in the end if you work it out right. So,
absolutely. That's terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes just finishing up the lecture, and we can talk about all of this stuff, because heaven knows there's plenty in that to be able to achieve as well. So let me finish up, and so I'm going to take a few minutes and just let me do this. As we were talking, and especially as we were talking before Dr. Lovejoy came in, it really has to do with the problem of trying to find these technical fixes in ways that match the politics and weaving them together in a way that we could actually drive solutions. That was the core of what he was talking about, and that's the core that any effective effort to try to deal with climate change is going to have to require. And his effort to try to lay some of these things out, as well as his work in his career in a variety of different kinds of settings to get at these things, is precisely the kind of message that we're trying to explore in the material we have for this class. As we start talking about carbon dioxide in particular, and as Dr. Lovejoy pointed out, the impact on climate, on the world's oceans, on biodiversity is significant and huge. There's a very interesting new Google Earth feature that's available that shows CO2 emissions just in the United States, which is really fascinating, based on good, hard scientific data, but graphed in a way that is fascinating. And the link there on the slide shows how that works, and what I've got, if this works well, is to demonstrate how this in fact works in the United States. Here's a slide from this Google Earth website that shows concentrations of climate change gases, and we'll zoom in here on maybe the Philadelphia region, and this Carbon County, PA, which emits a fair amount of carbon-based gases, as we can see. But you can zoom in here even more. And so what you can see here is, with this legend, a collection of different kinds of emissions that different areas are responsible for. You can zoom in on any place in the United States to see where most of the emissions are coming from, both in terms of carbon that comes from manufacturing, from cars, from a whole variety of sources as well, because the other side of this has the legend of aircraft, commercial, electricity production, industrial, and other kinds of sources. So you can see that in good old York County, there's a fair amount of carbon emission, CO2 emission that comes from electricity production. Philadelphia County, a large part of it is industrial. And you can see here where in Philadelphia County, for example, where we're sitting now, some of it comes from aircraft, some from commercial, electric production, industrial, non-road, on-road, and residential use. So you get a sense of where it is that greenhouse gases, and in particular here, the efforts to try to deal with CO2 come from. And so this, what we've got is a new kind of technique that was simply not available until very recently, just to try to identify this. The advantage of something like this is you can zoom in, zoom out, and zoom into your favorite part of the country, and even if you just look at even some parts of Kansas out here that have significant amounts of emissions, all of it is red, most of it's from electricity. And so you can see a couple of things here. One is an effort to try to identify greenhouse gases as an issue. It's an effort to try to use Google Earth, which is a fascinating thing that can be used for all kinds of different kinds of purposes, to produce graphical images of what it is that matters and where. You can see how different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions are different and differentially important in different parts of the country. Some parts you're talking about airplanes as being a significant piece, not a major part out in the middle of Kansas, but on the other hand, electricity production tends to be a major piece of the problem no matter where it is that you go. And so when you start trying to say what we're going to do is reduce CO2 emissions, the source of the emissions varies tremendously depending on where you live. The policy strategies most likely to work, therefore, have to be applied differently in different parts of the country. And when people start talking about trying to decrease the amount of CO2 emissions, what you're really talking about is differential impact by region by industry, and therefore different kinds of politics in different places as well. Because at the point where you say we're going to force the people who emit carbon dioxide to behave differently, some places you may be talking about trying to discourage people from chopping down forests. In other places you're going to be asking them to try to get their electricity in different places. And yet other places you're going to be asking people to drive differently as well. And so the advantage of being able to deal with this is to try to facilitate a broader conversation. And this, quite frankly, is material that just wasn't available otherwise until very, very recently. As best I can tell, in fact, this was just released, if not today, in the last week. And you can use this to identify and look at your favorite town, down to the county level, some sense of what the emissions are. Very powerful tool. Available now mainly for the United States, but Google Earth is going to be expanding this effort to try to take emissions on the one hand and map it by area, and use that to try to help people understand how where they live, are contributing to the growth of greenhouse gases. Very interesting effort, I think, that's underway right now to try to use new technologies for talking about the issues that we have to try to explore, which really gets into the summary that we want to try to talk about today. Summary of the issues have to do with the fact that the prospects for dealing with issues of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions really depend on national politics. It is one thing to try to say that what we need to do is do something to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and start with CO2, for example. But everything that has to do with greenhouse gas emissions on a global setting has to do with the way it affects individual politics at a local level. Tip O'Neill, the former Democratic leader and Speaker of the House, used to say that all politics is local. Everything gets broken down to how it affects people locally. The same is true in spades when we start talking about issues of climate change. Because in the sense, even though we're talking about broad, global kinds of impacts, what we're really talking about is how it affects the reefs that may be outside on your particular beach. It may be the kind of air that you breathe and how safe it is. It may be how it's affecting the microclimate in your neighborhood. It may be whether or not you can actually farm in the way that you used to, or whether or not you need to change your manufacturing techniques. All greenhouse gas emission policies, all efforts to try to deal with climate change are at their core local. And therefore, local politics tends to accumulate up into the broad national debates that shape the way in which greenhouse gas emissions are managed. What we have now is a kind of historic focus on these issues in a way which we've never seen before. We even have this new round of negotiations emerging in Copenhagen. They're going to be sitting, talking in December, debating what we ought to do, but the challenge is trying to figure out what it is that we can do that then becomes actionable, because broad debates without policy action standing behind it is meaningless. We come to this dilemma of whether or not the action ought to be somehow based on a global efficiency market-based peace for which we frankly don't have very good governance systems across the world, or whether we rely on the governance systems that we do have at the level of the nation state, where the leverage and the policies and the problems may not be quite uniform or quite equal, and where the global strategy depends on the ability and the willingness of each government to be able to take actions, and the ability of each government within its country to be able to leverage all the actions as they move down from the national to the state to the local level, depending on where it is that they may be. In the end, because the impacts are local, the politics are local. The impacts are global, and the politics of the global peace have to be understood in the local reality. The great contribution of Cass's argument, the great contribution of Cass's book that we read for this week, is an understanding of how the local pieces of politics, how rhetoric, how science, how economics shape and transform national policies, and how national policies connect up with the broad and fundamental questions of global efforts to deal with climate change. The conclusion, in short, is simple, that if we're going to have an effective global strategy, we need a set of effective national approaches. And the national approaches have to depend on framing the question in a way that creates and drives national politics toward effective action. You can see how important that is by looking at the way in which politics has been transformed in the United States with the election of Barack Obama. For better or worse, national policy debate's fundamentally different than it was just 6 months ago. But the problem now is trying to figure out how to galvanize and drive local politics through our national institutions in the United States to produce effective action, and to make sure that's mirrored in other countries at the same time. So, the conclusion is simple. Global efforts to deal with climate change depend ultimately on national level efforts to create and enact and embrace and pursue policies that produce the results that we want. That's the presentation for today. Next week, the students here in this class are going to be working on the projects. Week after that, they'll be away on spring break. In 2 weeks, we'll return for a look at the next generation of issues that lie behind the issues of climate change. Thanks much.